Welcome back to the Vaultcast. We have a tremendous episode for you this week with our very own Daniel Kraus, celebrated horror author, co-writer of The Shape of Water. His recent book, Whalefall, tore up the New York Times bestseller charts. And of course, Daniel is also a favorite comic book writer of mine. From his first Vault book, The Autumnal, an instant horror classic, to his recent contributions to Nightfall double feature with his own tale, The Cemeterians. We get into the scope of Daniel's career, transitioning from prose to comics, what it has been like to dive into research he never thought he would do, what working with Guillermo del Toro was like. This is a fascinating conversation with a master of the writing craft. So please enjoy our interview with Daniel Kraus. Folks, we are here with, dare I say, celebrated novelist and comics creator, Mr. Daniel Kraus. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's so good to see you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Nice to see you as well.
It's good to be chatting about all things comics, novels, movie adaptations. You're a busy man. You got a lot going on. But, you know, for some folks who might only know you from your comics work, it might seem, you know, relatively new on the scene, only a few years, but you've been plugging away as a novelist for quite some time. I mean, over 15 years now. Is that right?
You know, that's exactly right. And the only reason I know that, because I'm bad with dates, is that my first book, there's a 15th anniversary edition coming out next year. I was just talking about it today with somebody, and that's how I know that 15 years is how long I've been writing. But in that time, I've, written 20 or more novels. So it's been a productive 15 for sure.
Well, you didn't just burst on the scene, and take the entire industry by storm. Obviously, there was a lead up before writing became your full-time focus.
Let's see. I mean, I published my first novel in 2009. And so at that time, I was a book reviewer, actually. That was my full-time job. I was a book reviewer and book review editor for a magazine. That was my full-time job. And then a little before that, I was a librarian for only a couple years. And then eventually I went full-time writing.
When you were a librarian, were you doing any curation or any sort of collections work?
That's a good question. Yes, but it was an academic library, college. So it wasn't like I was specifically being able to do a display of horror titles. It was more academic than that. It was more refreshing the collection and helping people with the reference desk. So I didn't get to do a lot of collation like that. But when I was a book review magazine writer and editor, I got to do that kind of stuff all the time, like put together lists of books or collections of books all the time that we wanted to highlight. I got to do some of that.
When you were reviewing books, what was your reading pace? How quickly were you having to consume something and then turn it around and get your review taken care of?
Yeah, this is fun because no one ever asked me about this stuff, but it was insane. I would be reading several books a week. So the leisurely, or what you would think of the normal pace of reading a book, went totally out the window. That was the downside of the job. It sounds like a really cool job, and in a lot of ways it was, but it just devoured your life. Because you had to be reading nights and weekends, just constantly to have any chance of getting those books read or reviewed.
What was the turnaround time like? Here's the book, either your review's got to be ready by...
It depended because they have advanced copies that would come out. So we were a pre-publication journal. So we would get books a few months before they came out so that in theory, our reviews could come out in the magazine right about the time that they were published. So sometimes you'd get them 4 months in advance. Sometimes you'd get them 8 months in advance. It kind of depended on each publisher's schedule. But because you were always on that schedule, it was always pressurized. You never had very long. And then occasionally you get books that were high priority books that were embargoed titles that you wouldn't get until the last second. And those you had to turn around sometimes overnight. So you'd have to just get the book, read it for 24 hours, and then turn in the review.
Wow. 24 hours from the time you get a book, like a full novel, until you need to put out the review. I mean, what were the length of some of your reviews? How many words were you having to then turn out of that?
The nice thing is that the reviews were generally short. You never get one that was longer than 150 words. They were short reviews. Now, occasionally you'd have to write features that were, might be 1,000 words or something. But I remember the very first week that I worked there was an embargoed book. It was probably 600 or 700 pages I got handed. And I just kind of stayed home one day from the office and just read and got that thing, plowed through it. I don't like how it destroyed my free time, but
sure.
The one benefit of it was that it did lead to me reading lots and lots of stuff that I would not normally read. And I'm a huge believer in reading outside your genre or watching movies outside your genre or all that. To me, it's the single most enriching thing you can do. Like, I feel like I can tell when a creator only partakes in media of their genre. There's a feedback loopiness about it that I feel like I can just tell it. So I really appreciated that, and I tried to keep up with that.
So when you were getting all of these books thrown at you that you had these rapid reviews for, was there any sort of narrowing down of the field? Were you only doing fiction, or was there any sort of genre niche that they allowed you into or pushed you towards?
Well, I mean, the goal was never to make anyone unhappy. So, like, within reason, you could choose your own book. So, like, there might be an issue that was all about, let's say it was a romance issue. You were probably going to have to review a bunch of romances that issue. But within that category, you could probably more or less choose which romances you wanted to review. So there was some flexibility there, but also there were just books that were high priority in some way and needed to get reviewed, and somebody had to take them. You know, you read a lot of stuff that wasn't your cup of tea. Then you also found a bunch of stuff that you didn't think was your cup of tea that turned out was your cup of tea. It really was sort of a double-edged sword, and there were some great things about it.
Did you take away from that time any key lessons? Obviously, become a better writer, you got to be a good reader, right? You know, you should be reading a lot if you want to improve your craft. But with some of those surprises, those books that wouldn't have been on your radar, were there any lessons from reading and reviewing those books that have found their way into your own writing over the years?
Oh, I'm sure. It's the same way that, you know, I try to watch as many movies I can on the Criterion channel, you know, like strange foreign films, just random things that you can't identify as something that would necessarily be for you. So I would just make discoveries like that all the time. And I have no doubt that a lot of them have affected me. Also, even the books you're not reviewing, you're just seeing a lot of books. Things are different now. Post-pandemic, I understand, changed the entire kind of reviewing industry, but at that time, it was still mostly physical books that we were getting into the office. Your eyes were just always on books. And so even if you weren't specifically reviewing, you were reading someone else's review of it, or you were just seeing the books in the hallway, and you were just exposed to a lot of different approaches. Even if all you did was open a book and look at the pages, you might see a book that looked different. Like, I know that sounds weird. That makes more sense if you're talking about a comic. I swear I learned to glean things from a book just by opening them. Like, not even reading the words, just seeing the way the paragraphs are formed. It's kind of like the length of the paragraphs. You can look at a 2-page spread in a novel, and even blurring your eyes and not reading individual words, you get a sense of how the writer uses words. Are all the words kind of the same length? Are some of the words more compound? How do they handle quotation? You know, you can sort of get a sense of almost the ambition or scope of a writer based on almost like graphical things on the page. So anyway, it made me think about a lot of different ways to work with text in a lot of unusual ways that I think a lot of writers wouldn't think about. So I think it was really helpful to be as a writer, but has a sort of expiration date maybe to it. It was like an academic lesson for me. Like, I spent 10 years in it and learned a bunch, but I couldn't stay there if I wanted to actually churn out a bunch of work.
I mean, when would you have had the time?
Well, I didn't. I think I published maybe my first 10 books, maybe less when I was there. You know, once you add writing books to the thing, you are wiping out. I didn't go on a single vacation for probably that entire decade.
Wow.
All weekends, all holidays, all nights. Like, it really was a brutal period in a lot of ways, but it's kind of where I firmly established my kind of work ethic that I still try to keep up.
What does that work ethic look like today? Now that you're not managing another job, what does your typical writing day look like?
Well, I still work really hard. I always say I treat it like I'm going into the factory. You know, anything I can do to create less of a precious nature on writing, the better. I want to be the opposite of somebody who has to have various writing rituals and routines. I want to be able to write anywhere at any time. I get up, jump in the shower, get out, immediately start writing. But I'm basically here in front of the computer. I just do good, solid 8-hour days, you know? And it's not hard for me because I really love it. Like, there's no way I would have worked all those weekends and holidays for all those years if I didn't love it. I always talk about how I take off Sundays now. For years and years, I wrote 7 days a week. And to this day, Sundays are difficult for me because I just want to be writing.
I mean, obviously you found what you were meant to do if taking a day off from it is challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. There's downsides to that sort of obsession, any kind of obsession. There's going to be some collateral damage with any life that's focused on something. So that's why I have to, and I've tried to over the past decade, get better about like paying attention to like other things. And I'm not very good at it, and I generally fail at it, but I'm trying to pay attention to the rest of the world and the rest of life as well. That is probably my biggest personal challenge.
Looking at all those novels, doing the reviews, and, you know, having this much thrown at you and being able to take a step back and kind of look at how a writer's utilizing words and how the paragraph falls and how things lay out on the page, I think embody a different style and a really fine-tuned approach to the efficiency of language and using words, using sentences, using paragraphs in effective and interesting ways in your most recent novel, in Whalefall. I think especially once you're through part one and you get into part two and you have a different pace, a different cadence, a different rhythm, and the book looks differently on the page. Was that a conscious decision early on, or was that something you kind of found along the way once you were, pardon the phrase, in the belly of the beast?
It's always a conscious decision, but sometimes you have a notion of it before you start, but really it's not until you start writing that you have any clear sense of how it's going to play out. It's like right now, as we speak here, just in my other window of my computer, I'm working on this book that I'm maybe 20,000 words into. And basically all I've done is just gone back and forth of those 20,000 words because I have sensed that they're not right. The rhythm's not right. The way I'm breaking up the pages or the chapters isn't quite right. And until you figure out what that pace is, kind of what that voice is of every individual book, it's never going to be great. And it was the same. It went pretty quickly with Whalefall. I clued into how it was going to work relatively quickly. So I think within like a week or so, I kind of had, okay, I'm going to do these flashbacks and they're going to be really small. And I got lucky and I got stumbled on it early and I was like, all right, this is working. Sometimes it takes a lot longer before you figure out that thing. A lot of it's structure, like, you know, should these chapters be longer? Should they be shorter? Should there be, you know, sort of paragraph spaces in subsections? Are the sentences short? Are the sentences long? Are you putting quotation marks on the quotes? Are you not? You know, and that's aside from, is it first person, third person, present tense, past tense? I mean, there's just all these variables, and ideally they mean something. Like, you're not just making these choices. Well, I did third person last time, I'm going to do first person this time. That's ridiculous. All these decisions you're making to come from somewhere. Like, why? First person is a great example. Like, why would I ever write something in first person unless it had a very unique first person voice to it? I don't even see the purpose of it. You have to kind of use these choices in a meaningful way to come anywhere close to kind of completing the aims of being a writer, I think.
When you're applying this sort of detailed and meticulous look at rhythm, at pacing, at word choice, at quotations, does your relationship with your editors come into play at all? Is this something that you bounce back and forth with them, or is this more a solitary pursuit on your own part?
Well, I mean, I think the voice of it is pretty solitary. The editors play a big role once the book is handed in. I mean, I know authors who have a very different relationship with their editors. They tend to be much more hesitant authors. That doesn't mean their final projects aren't amazing, but you know, they'll write like a chapter and they're like, it's just, I don't know if this worked, and they'll send it to their editors almost chapter by chapter, and there's much more of a dialogue going on. I sort of work in the opposite of that. I'll do several drafts of the book before I send it into the editor. So it's relatively finely tuned as far as the voice goes, and it's more just a matter of plotting specifics and bringing out more of this or less of that or whatever. So in my case, this has much to do with sort of the initial, the overriding voice.
So then what is that voice development like when you have a co-author? Obviously, you've done, you know, novels with Guillermo del Toro. What's that process like when you're finding a voice for something in a co-writer capacity?
Yeah, I've done 4 different collaborator novels, which is 4 more than I ever expected I would have, because I like working alone. I mean, that's sort of why I got into novels, because I really like working alone. It's a challenge, but it's a good challenge. You know, one thing I have been laser focused on, certainly in the latter half of my career, is not repeating myself or writing a book that feels like another book that I've written. And I guess that's okay if you're writing a series, you know, if you're on book 18 of a series, then I guess they should all sort of feel somewhat similar. But if you're doing kind of standalones like me, that's the last thing. I want everything to be radically different, which actually is probably a bad idea when it comes sort of commercially minded. Readers tend to kind of want something sort of similar sometimes. But anyway, that's kind of how I operate. So a good way to smash yourself up a little bit and force yourself to write in a different way is to work with a co-writer. That's not generally why I'm working with a co-writer, but it's the best thing about it. You're dealing with somebody who's going to have their own points of view, their own ideas, and you're going to have to crash up against that. And there's going to be friction, good friction, in trying to figure out, well, how's this going to play? And so, essentially you have to create, at least in my experience, a third voice. If I'm doing one of my books with George Romero or something, well, George Romero has a writing style and I have a writing style. But what I have to come up with is what is the Romero Kraus style? And that's going to take some playing with. Like, what happens when these two people write together? What third voice emerges from that? And then once I figure that out, which might take a while, that's how the book's going to sound. But you have to learn it first.
And obviously it's going to change pretty radically when you're, working with, a film legend like, George Romero and taking over a project posthumously like that versus actively working on, say, a film that is in development or you've seen the script for or is in various stages of production. Like when it comes to a novelization of a film, like you did with The Shape of Water, where was the film when you came on board or began working on the novelization? Was it just a script at that point? Had you seen any dailies? Was there a rough cut? Where did you come on board and what did you have to work from?
Well, The Shape of Water is always a complicated one to discuss because The Shape of Water began with me. Like, it was an idea I had for a novel back when I was just a kid, actually.
How did I not know that?
It was a book I never wrote. It was a book that I always had notes for and whatever. I could never figure it out. Like, it was always missing a lot. I had just the premise, basically. And then eventually, when I told Guillermo about it when we were working on Troll Hunters, he then kind of took it and started writing the screenplay of it. The short version is when I was actually writing the book, I had the full screenplay that was written. So in that sense, there was elements of novelization to it. The difference was it had also begun with. And because of that, I had certain ideas that I'd always had that for the book that I was able to work into the book that existed prior to the movie. The only other thing I can think of ever that feels like this is 2001, where you had the movie by Kubrick and the book by Arthur C. Clarke come out simultaneously. And they both more or less have the same plot beats, but they're both fairly different in sort of feel. That is a close model of how the Shape of Water project worked out.
That's fascinating. You've had so many different kinds of collaborators. I mean, then when you look at something like Wrath, where you're working with, PhD.
Sharon Noel, he's a biogeneticist.
I mean, they're obviously, I would assume that you'd be leaning on them for their technical expertise and their way into the story being the real science behind it. What's it like to take what could be an academic lecture about, bioengineering and bioethics and try to, work on a narrative from that with someone?
Yeah, that was a really unique, cool project. And Sharon is like this world-renowned geneticist and had come up with this story idea that was really good. Not only was all of it based on sort of very near future science, she had a great story too. It wasn't just like, here's some science, make a story out of it. He had the story and it was fantastic, but it was so out of my wheelhouse as far as like understanding any of it that it required daily conversations. He's all across the world. He was always in some strange place that was 18 hours ahead or something. And we'd have to find a way to get on the phone, and he would sort of give me a primer on that day's scene. Like, I sort of knew how it was going to go, but I didn't understand how this little bit of science worked or what this like tool did. And she was a great teacher in that way. And I would just had these daily crash courses in science. And, for a brief period of time there, I was conversant in like genetics and genetic tampering, because that book's sort of about designer pets, which are a thing that already exists largely in China, but they certainly exist here and there'll be more of them. And that sort of goes awry. Again, like you said, all the collaborations are very different.
Well, for my money, personal plug. If you haven't read Wrath, I loved that book. That book is so well paced, very hard to put down.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Absolutely. You've got this experience, you've got this background in collaborating with people in various different contexts that obviously probably served you well to make the transition over into comics, but definitely a different animal when you're working with an illustrator, when you're working with an artist. What lessons did you take from those previous collaborations that you could apply to comics working with artists? Or what have you learned in working with artists that you've been able to take over into collaborating on novels?
I don't think there was much I could take from collaborating with a co-novelist to comic. That kind of collaboration is a lot different. The one thing that oddly I've always thought was sort of similar was whenever I would have an audiobook to a book. I never listened to them because I don't want to listen to my own books, but I sort of sampled them a little bit. At least once I did listen to a full audiobook. I had a career reason that I needed to reread the book. So I thought, well, I'll listen. And it was a book that I was never fully happy with. But the audiobook was so good. The performance made me like the book better. And it filled out the parts of the book that I thought were lacking. And the sort of like surprise and joy of that reminds me of getting the first pages of my first comic back, where it's like, I think I did an okay job. But then you're like, oh, okay, now this other person has added to it. Now it's good. I get it. Like, so this is kind of like a handshake that, I'm alley-ooping the ball that somebody else has to slam dunk it. So the other question is interesting. Have I taken anything from comics to go backwards? I don't know. I mean, I think there's always you accrue experience in a career, and particularly when it comes to plotting, I think there's things I've probably learned in comic plotting, which has to be a little swifter, has probably positively influenced the novels a bit. Like, I don't think early in my career I could have written something like Whalefall that's so, in a weird way, so straightforward, where I think in my early career, I was always getting in my own way and complicating things because I felt like you were supposed to in a way. Whereas comics are so, in some ways anyway, they're clearer, which I think perhaps has opened me up to just being like, I didn't overthink the beginning of Whalefall. It's like, well, let's just have him walking to the water so he can get into it. Like, it just start at the start, which is a lesson that took a surprisingly long time for me to learn.
Interesting. Well, I mean, to follow through on the basketball analogy you just made with the alley-oop, obviously I got a bias here, but I think when Chris Sheehan took the rock from you and put it in the hoop, that was a backboard shattering slam dunk.
It's true.
The Autumnal has quickly found its place into comic book canon for horror fans, especially as like required seasonal reading. You pull out Autumnal every fall. And that's not just, myself saying that. There's one comic shop in particular, Bat City Comics in Bradenton, Florida. Good fans of Vault. Shannon and Matt at Bat City have sold well over 100 copies of that trade. It's like their go-to, you want to read horror comics? Here you go. I was curious, what was the pitch? What was the introduction? How did you get into having your first comic after, you've already got an established career as a novelist? What was the moment? Who made the introduction, or how did the Autumnal come to be? The
Autumnal was an idea that I had, like The Shape of Water or anything else, that was just one of my ideas that had been around for a little while. And I've got a bunch of those that they float around and they either catch fire one day or they don't. And I don't remember if I started trying to write out kind of a proposal for it, because sometimes I'll just try to get the story straight in my own head. And it just seems so visual. Like, I really liked the idea of all of these autumn leaves, and it just made me think, well, maybe this should be a comic book. So it was really just me kind of stumbling across this. As we've talked about before, I didn't grow up with comics, so I have almost no comic background whatsoever. So it was not a space that I was very familiar with. I was just like, I feel like this should be a comic. I don't really know how to go about doing that. And then I don't precisely remember how I got introduced to Adrian at Vault. It was one of two things. Either Adrian reached out to me, like proactively, and said, I'm a fan, what have you got? Or it's possible, because I was right around the time that I met Michael Morrissey. So it's possible that Mike was like, oh, you should show this to Vault. Or maybe he told Adrian that I'm someone.
Adrian does the introductions for all of these episodes, so we'll get the story.
I don't remember which one it was. But anyway, I ended up talking to Adrian. He liked the idea. I took the same approach I take with novels, where I just wrote the entire thing outright so that I was handing him the entire run at once. I understand that's not how people often do it, but like, I don't get writing one issue. I don't get the running in front of the boulder, like trying to get an issue out and you don't know where it's all going to end. Because I'm writing issue 8, I'm coming up with the ideas that are affecting issue 1, and I'm going back and changing that. So it both confuses me and impresses me how comic writers are able to write issue per issue without knowing where the end. But anyway, that's how I did it. And it felt like it came naturally to me. I've heard from other comic creators horror stories of certain unnamed novelists trying to get into comics and just making a total disaster of it. But for whatever reason, for me, maybe because I've done screenplay work, and screenplay work is sort of similar to comics in a lot of ways, sure, I took to it really naturally. It felt right coming out mostly.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're directing on the page. You're thinking in visual language. I'm sure there's a lot of crossover between the two skill sets. Now, if you wrote everything at the chunk, delivered all the scripts at the same time, once you got visuals back, once you started to see things really come in, did you then go back and look at all of those scripts and make any adjustments or changes?
I don't think I did. No doubt Adrian had notes on certain things, but I don't know that they were reactive notes. I don't think we were reacting to the art at all. Aside from just being like, holy shit, this art is amazing. That was the major reaction. Yeah, I don't know that I'll probably ever have a comic experience like I did with the Autumnal because it was my first one. I just loved every second of it. And it was just a perfect introductory experience. I have great affection for that book. I've got a big Autumnal poster hanging right here just because it was one of the happiest I've ever been with the project from just beginning to end. It was just lovely.
Did you have the ending in mind? Like for years, were you holding on to that ending, or did that come to you once you really got into the meat of the story? Because that ending is something that when people are at conventions and they pick it up, or I put it in their hands because they're looking at horror titles, I'm like, you need one horror book, you got $15, you want one horror book, this is the one. I always stop people before they get to the end. I'm like, don't look at the ending because it haunts me to this day. So was that there with Inception, or did you find that along the way?
I don't think it was there with Inception. It was really the premise. So like, it was probably, the Inception was probably the first 2 or 3 issues. It was when I was writing up the proposal probably that I started to come up with the larger shape of it. But it might not have been until I was actually writing the script that, probably halfway through the scripts is when I was like, oh, see how this has to go. I will say nothing else. I don't want to spoil anything, but
don't look anything up. Just grab a copy and enjoy the ride. When approaching a comic in horror specifically, you've got a different tool set available to you that you don't have with a novel. Obviously, being a visual medium, and there's some parallels, obviously, to film. One thing that I find really interesting about horror comics is you, as the reader, have to continue. You are implicit in whatever horror you are witnessing. You have to turn the page. You guide your eye through the panels at your own speed. But I was curious, since you've worked extensively in horror novels, film, and comics, is there anything that you find horror comics do exceptionally well with that genre? What do comics do for horror that you enjoy?
Well, I'll tell you, it's probably the greatest and simplest and first lesson that Adrian taught me when I turned in the scripts was that something comics do them better than any other medium is this ability to flash through time quickly. If someone says something, people are having a conversation, one of the panels can just suddenly be about what they're having a conversation about. Like the ease with which you can move through space and time is, I think, really productive with horror because anything can suddenly be horrific. There's no safe spot, really, because any panel, you're not guided by budgetary or constraints of movies, and you don't have the sort of backlog or load that you would have in novels of trying to set up what the hell you're doing there. Like it'd probably take paragraphs to even try to figure out what you're transposing. There's a grace, swiftness to what comics can do visually and how they can offset from what is being said has continued to be what I found most exciting about comics is usually when you're writing, you sort of have to write about what you're writing about. That sounds ridiculous to even say. You have to write about what you're writing about. But in comics, you can sort of write about something, but tell the artist to do something completely opposite or contradictory. And the juxtaposition of those is really cool and exciting and can be really scary.
I think that you utilize the manipulation of space and time to great effect in your comics work. And I do appreciate the ability to just suddenly flash to something horrific or that seems totally out of left field. It's such a fertile playground that doesn't require CGI. It doesn't require montage. It doesn't require backlog or prelude. Exactly like what you're saying. Do you find in something else, a screenplay or a novel, and wish, God, I wish I could just put a panel in here?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. I don't know if I seriously long for it. Like, I'm sure there's moments where I'm writing on a novel and, I can just sort of see clearly what I want to say. Of course, that's the whole purpose of writing a novel is how you say it is going to be what's so cool about it. But yeah, I think a lot of that envisioning of a novel begins as a series of panels, really. Like you're thinking to some degree, we're always thinking in panels in just general daily life, anytime you're imagining anything. So yeah, I think it starts there anyway.
Now, to your latest book with Vault, The Cemeterians, I heard the premise, I heard the pitch for the first time, and I verbatim said, "What the fuck is this book?"
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm curious, what was your initial pitch? How do you describe the story of the Cemeterians to people?
Yeah, it's a weird one. In some ways, it's almost the absolute opposite of something like Autumnal, which was very novelistic in a way, like very kind of quiet and slow burn and kind of sensitive. And sort of on purpose, I wanted the Cemeterians, I wanted to experiment with doing something that was kind of gigantic and halfway ridiculous and bigger and broader than really anything else I've ever done. It has this kind of scope to it, all science.
It's sprawling. It's a wild premise. It's got a big mystery component. Like, it's a big story.
Yeah, Cemeterians is a kind of X-Files-esque pairing of this kind of religious expert and this kind of rogue scientist in trying to figure out why human bones are showing up all over the world in inanimate objects. So obviously a pretty wild idea, and it goes to some absolutely far out places. And it kind of comes back to when I was in college and I was in a film production class. So this was back in probably 96, 97, something like that. So we were actually working with film. And I remember one of our teachers saying that film had organic matter in it. Any kind of still film, 35 millimeter film, it has bits. It's in the cemetery. The scientist character mentions the kind of organic matter that's in film. And that always sort of resonated with me in some way, that we're part of the format of the art we're watching used to be alive. And so I've been kind of tossing around an idea that was about the propensity of living matter that's in inanimate matter somehow kind of coming back to life. And this is where I finally got to kind of play with that notion. Suddenly, bones erupting from all sorts of places over the earth. And that was the fun of it for me, is just sort of like blundering into the unknown and just kind of loading it up with ideas and seeing where the hell they took me. I can tell you that, and I don't think this is much of a spoiler because it's just too weird. When I started, I did not intend for the last issue to explain where dinosaurs came from. You know what I mean? Like, places I ended up were so bizarre and just these huge, crazy swings.
It takes a horrific twist on that notion, like we're all stardust. The stuff that was in the earliest time of the universe is in our bones, making up our body, and just kind of twists that in a way that is so unsettling.
I also really liked the idea that cemeteries can be somehow a bad thing. I feel like that's a really uncomfortable idea. You know, I think we all have, whether we're religious or not or anything like that, we have some reverence for cemeteries. And just how upsetting would it be that if we found out in some sort of afterlife underworld way that the creation of cemeteries was a huge mistake that was causing all sorts of problems in sort of the underworld / afterlife. I just feel like that's a uncomfortable idea. And so I like that a lot. And I remember that sort of around this time that I was thinking on this idea, I heard an interview on NPR and I heard the word cemeterian. I was like, wow, that's a great word. And somehow they all came together. Thus, Cemeterians.
Thank you, NPR, whether that was Fresh Air or whatever the program was for the title of the comic. This is one of those stories and one of those books that I think is jarring and horrifying, but is also so profoundly character-driven. The dynamic between our two leads, I think, is something that I really enjoy watching play out, and I think has obviously those shades of X-Files that you were talking about. But this really is a two-hander in every sense of the word, in like just having these two characters that are going through this together with their vastly different experiences and vastly different perspectives, sharing in this crazy premise. What do you think, in your own writing and this story in particular, makes a good two-hander, makes a good duo really work?
That's something that I have written a lot, actually. When I think back on my books, a lot of them were two-handers. I think to a writer, it's an appealing challenge. There's something about working with a huge sort of cast of characters that doesn't necessarily make things easier, but it relaxes the options. Like, you've got so many options. It's the same thing that makes a one-setting story appeal to me. The same reason, like, one of the appeals of Whalefall was that it's all going to take place in this whale stomach. Like, I like limiting, shrinking down options, because that's when you really have to prove yourself. You got nothing to hide behind it. So if you can write a story that takes place in one room with two characters in it, can really rock, you've proved that you can do it. Now, this is not a one-room story by any means, but that's what's appealing about the two characters, is that you just really have to mine all of your riches out of so few personalities. And so you have to kind of go a little deeper, and any sort of acrimony you can work in there and that can make the sparks fly a little bit. That's what kind of makes it come to life. Yeah, I'm a big fan of it, and we'll probably continue to do it.
Now, the Cemeterians is going to be out. Y'all can pick up the collected edition of this book here in just a couple of weeks. Daniel, are there any other projects you have on the horizon or things that are coming out soon that you want people to be on the lookout for?
I mean, I've got a bunch. The only one I think that has been really fully announced is a novel of mine that's coming out in 2025. It's the one I'm working on right now, called Angel Down, which is a book set in World War I. It's about a group of sort of ne'er-do-well soldiers who discover an angel that's been shot by artillery and has fallen onto the battlefield. And so they take it, and at first they're sort of in awe of what it could be and what it could do, what it might represent. But then they sort of, through backbiting and jealousy and greed, they start tearing themselves apart because everyone wants it for themselves. And so this sort of angelic figure creates a sort of personal hell for these soldiers.
Damn. Do you ever get tired of doing research on incredibly specific, like now you got to figure out World War I, you've had to do genetics, you had to do the marine biology.
I love research. I think a lot of creative writers start from a position in their careers of not wanting to do it because it feels like the antithesis of what the sort of free creativity they want to do. But what I discovered early on in my career with my second book really was that, to my surprise, research gave me all sorts of new ideas and better ideas and cooler ideas. So now I feel almost adrift without research because I know that whatever I planned, the research is going to make it so much better. And I'm going to come up with so many better, cooler ideas.
Well, it shows in your work. I don't think anyone would ever question as to whether to research something well. If folks want a chance to meet you, get a book signed, or, geek out about marine biology or anything, where can people see you this year? Are you going to be attending any conventions or shows or things?
Yeah, I know I'll be at StokerCon end of May. That's in San Diego this year.
We will be at StokerCon as well. So I'm sure we'll have copies of the Cemeterians and the Autumnal there for folks to pick up. Daniel Kraus, thank you so much for joining us. This was such an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed getting to hear your history and things I didn't even know. This was really informative and interesting. Thank you so much. And I hope we can have you back again soon.
Yeah, man. Absolutely my pleasure. Thanks, guys.
And that's our show. The Vaultcast was produced by Kyle Foucher and Daniel Crary, edited by Kyle Foucher, social media support by Britta Bisher. The Vaultcast logo was designed by Tim Daniel. Copyright 2024, Vault Comics. All rights reserved.